Hello again, this is Kevin with Custom Micro, and today we're going to do a walkthrough of the graphical user interface of the FS.com S3410-48TS-P Layer 2 Plus 48 port network switch. Let's do it. The default IP address of the switch when you unbox it is 192.168.1.1. So configure your network adapter to be on the same VLAN, and then pull up your favorite web browser and navigate to that IP address. When you first log in, it'll have you change the default password. I've already done that, so I'm going to go ahead and log in. Once you log in, you're greeted with a nice graphical interface, and there's a lot of options for us to look at. Let's start with the bar at the top. We see we have our model listed. We can click on detail and it gives us some information like start time, runtime, hardware version, and software version. Obviously, runtime is very useful if you think there's been a power outage or something along those lines. Over here on the right side, we have a wizard. If you want a very basic configuration just to get you going, maybe you need to change the IP range and the IP address of the switch to match your network. You can change the management, the default VLAN 1 management IP here, subnet mask gateway, DNS, even set your time zone, etc. Some unique things here. If you click on service, it actually takes you to the fs.com site where you can get support if you have technical support needs. If we go back, if you click on more, there's an option for firmware download, which will take you to the fs.com site for technical documentation for network switches in this series, and you can find technical documents, data sheets, even downloads. Also, it's worth mentioning at this point that if you purchase this switch, you can go and you can subscribe so you're notified anytime there's firmware or software updates for this switch. That can be very useful as FS is often updating the graphical interface or making bug fixes and changes, and so you always want to make sure you're running the latest firmware of these switches. Back to the switch itself, of course, you can log out. So when you log into the switch, you're greeted by the favorites tab or navigation on the left side. And under favorites, we start off with home. We have useful information like our CPU usage, memory usage, the number of ports that are up. Right now, it's just the port that I'm plugged into, current date and time, runtime, and your model, software version, device MAC, etc. We can see there's also port information just below that where we see right now only port 1 is connected, and even gives you how many packets have been sent and received. It can be very useful. If we go on down to VLAN, that's the next section under favorites. You can see I've already created some VLANs. You have the standard VLAN 1 that comes out of the box, and then I have previously created VLAN 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and 207. And you can go in and edit these, and you can change some of the information about very simply. You can actually decide what ports are untagged on these VLANs, which can be helpful for sure. So for example, if we wanted to tag VLAN 10 on port 48, we can just simply select it and click Save. This would be a good time to mention that port 47 and 48 are combo ports, sometimes known as dual personality ports. So for example, if you plug a 1 gig SFP transceiver into port 47 and you're actively using that port, the Ethernet port 47 will be disabled. So make sure you're aware of that. This does not affect port 49 and 50, which are your SFP plus ports, your 10 gig transceiver ports. Those are not combo ports. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at buying this switch. So back to our VLAN settings, we can also easily set trunk ports, which is nice. Notice you can set your native VLAN and then your allowed VLANs. So for example, if you wanted the native VLAN of the switch to be VLAN 10, and then you wanted the allowed VLANs to be 20, 30, 40, 50, then you could set those settings, and then you could pick a port on the switch and click Save, and it will apply those VLAN changes to that port. So this is a really nice way to manage your switch. Very intuitive, simple to use. But let's move on. We've covered the VLAN section pretty thoroughly. So we'll move on and we'll look at voice VLAN. Here we can set our VLAN number of our voice VLAN for our voice over IP phones. So next to status we have OUI. This is a really nice feature. So we can click add OUI and you can put the manufacturer part of the MAC address here. And so when you plug that phone into the network, it will automatically be detected as a voice device and it will automatically assign that to the proper voice VLAN. You also have an interface section where you can enable or disable the voice VLAN feature on that port. The next section under favorites is port. Here we can set up our layer 3 ports. Again, this is a layer 2 plus switch, so it does include some layer 3 functions. You can see I've already created some examples, VLAN 10, 20, and 207. We have the IP address and the subnet mask of those. These are basically interface VLANs. These are routed VLANs. Then we see below that our layer 2 ports, and we can see information about whether the port is up or down, enabled or disabled. You could look at it that way. And then also the access VLAN, native VLAN, and the VLANs that are permitted. You can always edit this over here by clicking edit. You can basically shut that port down. We can set the mode to access port, trunk port, or L3 port. We can set the native VLAN, and we can set the allowed VLAN. So in this example, VLAN 10 will be untagged and VLAN 30 will be tagged because it is an allowed VLAN. There are some advanced settings here where you can set that interface, your link speed and duplex manually. That can be helpful sometimes if the switch or device on the other end has those settings set manually. So you can set it for 10, 100, or gigabit, and you can set to full or half duplex. The next tab under port is aggregate port. This is where you can aggregate 2 or more network interfaces together. This can be extremely useful if you have a server or a NAS. For example, maybe you want to have multiple 1 gig interfaces that are all connected. You can create an aggregate port group and you can have multiple connections. That's good for resiliency in case one connection has a link failure, maybe a cable failure, and also can be beneficial because it increases the bandwidth between those devices. So this is where you would set those aggregate port groups. We also have port mirroring. So if you want to mirror a port, in essence capture packets from that port, maybe using Wireshark or something along those lines, because you want to be able to monitor the traffic on a particular port, you can enable port mirroring and you can monitor all packets or only inbound or outbound packets. The next section is rate limiting. This is a very nice feature of the switch. At the port level, you can limit the input and output rate, kind of set a speed limit on the port or interface, if you will. The next section under favorites is PoE settings. Here at the port level, we can click edit. We can enable or disable PoE. We can set the priority to low, high, critical, or default. And we can set the max power all the way up to a maximum of 36 watts. This can be very handy because occasionally network switches will not identify your PoE devices properly. They may not put them in the right class, and so it may not be supplying enough power. So if you know what class device you have and what its PoE rating is, you can set your cap of the wattage of that interface appropriately. There's also global settings for PoE. You see here, we see our total power budget. This switch has 2 370 watt power supplies, but I'm currently only using 1 power supply. Only one is plugged in, and so that limits our power budget. You can also set a power saving mode and enable or disable a non-standard mode. The next section under favorites is SSH. You have your global configuration, your authentication timeout, for example. You have the keys that you can set, public and private key pairs if you want to use those for your SSH sessions versus username and password. And then here you can assign those to a particular user. So that can be very handy. Right now SSH is not enabled. You just simply check the box and click apply. And then last, under favorites, you can restart the switch. Our next section on the left navigation is network. And then from there, the first part of network is MAC address. Let's take a look at that. You notice there's some nice hints here or notes that explain what these settings will do. A lot of this has to do with your port security and ways that you can allow traffic through those ports. The next tab over is filtering for filtering address settings, and it gives a similar description. I'm just explaining what that is and how you can utilize that on the network switch. Let's go down to the next section, which is routing. Again, it's nice that this switch does support a lot of layer 3 functionality. You can create static routes, you can add a default route, or you can delete selected routes. I've already created one example here of a route, and it basically tells you what the next hop is if you want to get to the 10.25.10 network or subnet. The next section under network is spanning tree protocol. You can enable that globally by just a toggle of this radio button. You have spanning tree port settings, so you can edit spanning tree at the port level. You can enable or disable port fast, BDP UGuard, connection mode, etc. You can set a priority, a lot of those common features. You also have your RLDP settings here, and that's a global setting. Notice here it says RLDP enables you to detect link failure quickly. RLDP can run on the port only after it is enabled globally. So if you want to use this feature, you have to enable it globally first before you can enable it at the port level. The next section under networking is IGMP snooping. Again, the notes here are very handy, especially if you're a novice to networking. You can understand what these features are and how they might be useful to you. And they're very accurate. Notice it says on layer 2 devices, multicast frames are flooded to all ports, causing storm and consuming much bandwidth. IGMP snooping is used to find out on which port there is an IGMP subscriber and only send IGMP traffic to that port so as to save bandwidth. So you can enable this feature, and it kind of gives you a little synopsis of what that feature does. The next one is DHCP relay. This one's a pretty common feature that people will use. Let's say you decide not to use the built-in DHCP server, which we'll look at later, and you would rather use a DHCP server on a domain controller or another networking device. You can set up and enable DHCP relay, add your DHCP server, and in essence, this is your helper IP address. So devices that will be plugged into the switch will be able to more easily find the DHCP server with that helper IP address. The last section under network is authentication. This is a pretty neat section. Here you could set up something like a radius server for authentication of devices that are plugged into the different ports on the switch. So you can set the server IP, redirection URL. There's also a section here or link for radius server settings. We'll go back here. There's different types of portals, etc. There's also an advanced section where you can set your HTTP session count, redirect timeout, etc. It is possible I'm misunderstanding what the use of this section is. It also possibly could be simply just to allow you to use something like a radius server for authentication of the web interface of the switch. So if you know the answer to that, feel free to add a comment down below, and we'll learn something together. The next section on the left navigation is security. Under security, the first option is DHCP snooping. Again, there's some nice notes here about what DHCP snooping is, and you can toggle that on. It's off by default. We have our gateway anti-ARP spoofing, and as I go through this, I'll just mention that this switch is advertised and noteworthy to have a lot of advanced security settings that may go above and beyond your standard layer 2 plus switch that's on the market today. So this could be a very good selling point if you're looking for a switch with extra security options. So you can set up anti-ARP spoofing, ARP check, DAI settings, and ARP entries. You notice there we have a dynamic binding of this IP address to this MAC address. This is what I currently have the IP address of my laptop set to. So this ARP entry list is doing a very good job of detecting that. The next section under security is IP source guard. You can add ports to this. And again, there's great explanations here. You can always pause the video at any time to take a look at what these options do. There's also user binding under IP source guard. And again, there's a good description, and you can add those bindings according to your needs. The next section is port security. This is where we can add a port, and this is a common setting on network switches where you can set your secure address, your security action, those kind of features. And then we have our security bindings. We can again add an address, bind an IP to a MAC, to a VLAN. It says port security is used to allow only the packet whose source MAC address is consistent with the secure address to enter the switch. Again, this is going to be your port level security, your 802.1x features. Then we have NFPP, and this is where you can globally enable these different sections or settings. ARP guard, IP guard, ICMP guard. Again, a lot of advanced security features. Really quite nice. Then we have our storm control, and you can set that up at the port level. You can set your storm control based on your bandwidth usage, the number of packets, or the kilobits. You can also set the percentage of your broadcast, multicast, and unicast traffic. That wraps up security. Let's move on to advanced. The first section under advanced is port protect. Again, another nice feature. This in essence is like your guest isolation. So if you don't want the clients on these different ports to be able to communicate with each other, they really just need internet access, you can select ports and enable that feature. The next section under advanced is DHCP. Here you can enable the DHCP server function of the switch. I use this often in a production environment if this is an edge switch in your environment. I've created a couple of examples already. This will be your routed VLAN IP address, and here's the IP range. You can of course edit these. There's also a feature for static addresses. So you can add a static address. So if you know the MAC address of that device and you want to set it to always get the same IP address when it's connected to the network, you can do that here. Or even better, you have a client display list and you can bind the MAC address to a dynamic IP. So as you have new dynamic clients that are added, as they get an IP address dynamically through the DHCP server, if you want them to always get that same IP address they were assigned the first time, you can simply bind the MAC address to that dynamic IP. The next section is ACL. Here you can create your standard access control list. If we click Add, you can also create extended ACLs. Once you've created the ACL, you can go back in and edit it and set it up accordingly for your needs. There's an ACL time and an ACL application. Very useful because especially if you want to disallow certain traffic during certain times, maybe after hours, you can do that here. And here we find the quality of service section. We talked about this a little bit earlier when we were talking about our voice VLAN, but here we can set up our class, our policy settings, and our flow settings as it relates to quality of service. So you want to do this in conjunction with setting up your voice VLAN to make sure that those packets are prioritized. And that wraps up the advanced section. We'll move along to system. Under system, the very first section is settings. Here we can set the system time and the time zone. You can also enable time synchronization, which is a nice feature. We can set the password for the web management. Underneath reset, you can restore the factory defaults. You can also import and export the startup configuration. Underneath enhancement, you can change your logout time, you can change your web access port, and you can enable redirection so it forces people, if they try to connect through port 80 HTTP, to redirect them to HTTPS. You can set up your SNMP version 2 and 3, your community strings, traps, all those type of things. And then last, under the settings, we can set up DNS servers. This will be helpful if you do set up an external network time protocol server, NTP server. If you use a URL, a host name, you'll have to have your DNS servers also set up for that to work. The next section under system is upgrade. I mentioned earlier, you can subscribe on FS site once you purchase one of these switches, and you'll be notified when new firmware updates are released. And this is where you would go to perform that upgrade from the web interface. Stay tuned because we will have a command line walkthrough of this network switch, and that'll be very helpful to you for those of you who prefer a command line interface. The next section in our system is system logging. Logging is enabled by default, and you can even display the log, and you can see the last 200 logs right here at a glance. Very helpful. There's some very useful troubleshooting tools under detection. First of all, you have your standard ping. A lot of network switches support this. But you also have traceroute right here in the web interface. So if you want to see how many hops it takes to get somewhere, see the path it's taking, it's a very useful tool. You even have cable detection. So you can see what's going on with cables that are connected to the ports. It tells you some information here about what it's going to do. And then lastly, collection. It says one-click collection is used to collect fault information for troubleshooting. So these are very useful tools. And finally, the last section under system is the web CLI, or command line interface. This is a really nice touch. If you noticed earlier, SSH is not enabled by default on the switch. So if you need to make a quick command line configuration change, you can do it right here in the web interface. There also are some features that you can only do through the CLI. For example, this switch does support stacking, but in order to enable stacking, you have to do that through the command line. So you can do it right here in the web interface. You just simply put your command input, click send, and you're done. So that covers our web interface walkthrough of the FS.com model S3410-48TS-P. You're going to want to stay tuned because we're going to have more videos to come about this switch. We're also going to have the command line walkthrough, and we have a special stacking video coming up. So you want to subscribe to our channel, ring that bell so you're notified when those videos go live. Thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time.